Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Happy 250th Independence Day to our listeners in the USA. It's episode 39. Let's get into it.
This week, we're chasing the stuff that's hiding in plain sight. We've got off-grid radios, boring office acoustics, and a spritz that quietly dethroned a decade-long favorite. All signals that were accelerating under the radar this week, while the headlines were looking somewhere else. Then we swing into Wake Up Ready, where we map the week ahead. A Fed minutes release with a new chair's fingerprints on it, 2 tariff deadlines stacking up, and a fresh crop of IPOs finding out what the aftermarket really thinks of them. After that, it's Knowledge Bomb, Humor Me, our greater debate, and we close with Let's Invent Again, a story about a scientist, a shovel, and the dirt everyone else was stepping over.
If there's a thread this week, it's that the loud stuff and the valuable stuff keep showing up in different zip codes.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Let's start underground, literally, with the radios nobody's marketing to you. Over the last week, a quiet corner of the internet has been obsessing over something called Meshtastic, open-source firmware that turns a $20 to $50 LoRa radio into a node on a private, decentralized mesh network. No cell tower, no ISP, no monthly bill. You send a text, it hops radio to radio until it finds its recipient, and the whole thing runs on a coin cell battery for weeks. This isn't new hardware. LoRa's been around for years, but what's changed is who's buying it and why. Hikers and preppers were the early crowd. Now it's suburban neighborhoods setting up shared local networks as a hedge against outages, and STEM classrooms using it to teach kids how radio waves and encryption actually work. Think of it as the analog version of keeping cash under the mattress. You hope you never need it, but the appeal is that it doesn't ask anyone's permission to work. The reason this is surfacing now is straightforward. More people are spending time in patchy coverage areas, and 2026's run of grid disruptions and service outages has made communication that doesn't depend on a single company feel less like a hobby and more like planning.
Every big centralized system eventually creates its own black market for redundancy. This is just the radio wave version of a backup generator, and it's cheaper than a generator too.
That same instinct, build your own resilient system instead of trusting the big one, is showing up somewhere you wouldn't expect: the office. While the headlines are still stuck on empty towers and commercial real estate write-downs, corporate occupiers who kept their space are quietly spending real money on acoustic and lighting design. Poor sound is consistently the #1 workplace complaint, so building owners are treating the floor plan like a set of tuned instruments. Fabric-wrapped panels here, activity-specific sound zones there, adaptive lighting calibrated to the time of day. One estimate puts the productivity gain from getting this right at 15 to 25%, which is the kind of number that gets a facilities budget approved. It's a strange pivot. For years, the story was how much space companies could shed. Now, for the space they're keeping, the fight is over how few square feet can be made to work harder, using sensory design instead of square footage as the lever. That's the tell. It's not a real estate story anymore. It's a cognitive performance story wearing a real estate costume. And it surfaced this week because 2026's office design trend reporting is converging on acoustics as the single line item every workplace consultant is now leading with.
Funny how we're downsizing and we're spending more per square foot on what's left turned out to be the same corporate memo.
That same substitution, spend more on the unglamorous input to get a better outcome, is exactly what's happening in industrial packaging right now. Mid-tier manufacturing podcasts spent the week buried in the biomaterials pivot, companies swapping petroleum-based foam and plastic for mycelium, that's mushroom root structure, and lab-grown collagen in product packaging. Dell and IKEA have already used mycelium packaging at commercial scale, and it turns out the stuff matches polystyrene on shock absorption while composting in a home bin within about 6 weeks. The real driver isn't a sudden outbreak of corporate conscience. It's the European Union's new packaging regulation, which phases in starting this August and requires recyclability by 2030. That's a hard compliance deadline with a hard revenue consequence. So, packaging suppliers who already own mycelium and biocomposite IP are seeing their order books swell months ahead of the requirement actually biting. The second order play here isn't the headline sustainability story. It's which mid cap materials science suppliers get to be the arms dealer for a regulation nobody else has priced in yet.
Regulation is just a deadline with a stock price attached if you know which supplier already has the patent ready to go.
Which brings us to a very different kind of substitution, one happening in how creators make money, not how factories package things. On media and marketing podcasts, the topic of the week was de-influencing, creators building bigger, stickier audiences by telling people what not to buy instead of what to buy. It sounds like the opposite of a business model, but 2026's creator marketing data backs it up. The industry is visibly breaking away from vanity metrics campaigns, and brands are shifting spend towards smaller, more trusted micro-creators, specifically because their skepticism reads as credibility. A recommendation that comes wrapped in, and here's what I'd skip, lands like a friend's advice instead of an ad, which is exactly the trust a saturated, algorithmically optimized feed has been steadily burning down. The second order effect lands on direct-to-consumer brands themselves. Traditional product placement is losing efficacy, so more of them are being forced into real transparency about ingredients, sourcing, and price, because the creators they're paying have realized that doubt is now a more valuable currency than hype.
Turns out I wouldn't buy this is the most expensive sentence in marketing right now.
And that same appetite for something unpolished and slightly hidden is exactly what's fueling one of the stranger stories in music right now, the corporate Lo-fi machine. Audio engineer threads on X spent the week pulling back the curtain on how anonymous entities produce enormous volumes of generic, algorithm-friendly ambient and lo-fi tracks, tuned specifically for focus and sleep playlists, optimized track lengths, optimized metadata, built to dominate passive listening slots. The lo-fi and ambient category has grown its playlist follower base by roughly 340% since 2020, and the math is blunt. 200 tracks pulling 10,000 streams each can throw off something like $8,000 a month, with longer 10-minute cuts earning more per play than a radio-length song. What's new this week is the backlash. Independent musicians are increasingly vocal that AI-generated tracks, trained on whatever's already popular, are crowding the human catalog out of exactly the playlists that used to fund working artists. It's the financialization of background noise, and it's a bigger business than the genre's aesthetic, deliberately unremarkable, would ever let on.
Nothing hides a cash machine better than something designed to be ignored.
Speaking of things designed to look unremarkable, let's talk about a fashion trend that's the exact opposite of flashy, the fisherman aesthetic, sometimes called anglercore. For a few years, consumer fashion chased the mountaineering look. Technical shells, summit-ready everything. Now the pull is toward oilskin coats, heavy knitwear, and duffel coats, working-class maritime gear, not alpine gear. Barbour's 2026 collaboration with the Scandinavian label Gani leaned hard into this, pairing waxed anoraks with Nordic tailoring, and both Prada and Miu Miu have quietly borrowed from the same well. The distinction from old-school gorpcore matters. Gorpcore was about conquering terrain, all technical bravado. Anglercore is about patience, waiting on a riverbank, wearing something that was built to survive salt water rather than built to be photographed. That's driving real revenue to heritage brands that never marketed to fashion buyers in their lives. And it surfaced this week specifically because trade coverage is now calling it the dominant menswear silhouette carrying into the back half of 2026.
When the fashion story stops being about status and starts being about durability, that's usually a mood signal, not just a style one.
That same rejection of the expected script is showing up in entertainment in the weirdest possible way. It's the hottest week of the summer, and the breakout Google Trends query is Summerween movies. Slasher films, autumnal aesthetics, cozy horror. Search interest more than doubled in the last month, with some trackers showing spikes over 500% for the specific phrase. Consumers, mid-heatwave, are actively searching for the atmosphere of October. That's a direct rejection of the traditional big-budget fireworks and explosions summer blockbuster calendar, and it tells streaming platforms and studios that their seasonal programming grid is now out of sync with actual audience appetite. The reason it's surfacing this week specifically is that Google's own Summergeist trend report just flagged it as one of the defining queries of the season, right as a wave of new slasher releases hit the calendar to meet the demand nobody scheduled for.
Consumers are using content to time travel out of the actual weather they're standing in.
And if audiences are mentally fleeing summer, plenty of them are still drinking their way through it, just not with the drink you'd expect. For nearly a decade, the Aperol Spritz has owned the warm weather beverage conversation. This week, Google Trends data confirmed the Hugo Spritz, Prosecco, elderflower liqueur, mint soda, has surged 2,200% against its historical baseline, and in more than a dozen states, it's now being searched more often than Aperol itself. That's not a niche shift. That's a category leader getting quietly outflanked. The practical consequence is a supply scramble for specialty botanicals like Saint Germain-style elderflower liqueur, and any retailer or bar slow to reposition inventory ahead of the rest of summer is going to watch this one walk right past them. It's the cleanest, single, hardest data point of the week, and it happened almost entirely outside of paid marketing. This was TikTok and home bartending content doing the work. Aperol's ad budget used to do alone.
A decade of category dominance undone by mint and elderflower. Humbling, honestly.
Let's shift from consumer taste to public markets, because the same quiet reallocation pattern is showing up in equities too, starting with a name most people have never heard of, Elite Pharmaceuticals, ticker ELTP, trading over the counter. This week's earnings call showed institutional revenue up 77% year over year on their generic central nervous system product line, but the real catalyst was management confirming they're actively evaluating an uplisting from the OTC market to the NASDAQ exchange. To be clear, this isn't a locked-in timeline. When a shareholder pressed for a specific date this summer, the CEO pushed back hard. But the evaluation itself was enough to pull in algorithmic scanners and retail momentum this week. The second-order play is for the boutique investment banks that specialize in small-cap listing compliance, because Elite is far from the only OTC name quietly weighing the same move to capture institutional liquidity it can't access while it's stuck on the over-the-counter tier.
The over-the-counter market is basically the farm league. Everyone's either trying to get called up or trying to look good enough that someone else makes an offer.
And while that money is chasing upside in a microcap, a very different type of capital was doing the opposite this week, moving towards safety. Look at the iShares Core 3070 Conservative Allocation ETF, ticker AOK, 30% equities, 70% fixed income, about as close to a capital preservation instrument as you'll find. Reporting this week confirmed a large jump in short interest on the fund through mid-June, which sounds like a bet against safety until you remember what a short position in a defensive fund can also signal. Desks expressing a view that even conservative allocations are due for repricing, or hedging elsewhere by trimming exposure here. Either read points to the same place. Sophisticated money is actively repositioning around a calm market, not simply riding it. And that kind of quiet positioning rarely shows up in a headline because there's no dramatic price move attached to it, just a shift in who's willing to hold what.
The scariest markets are the ones where nothing looks scary on the surface and everyone underneath is still quietly rearranging the furniture.
And nowhere is that quiet rearranging more visible than in currencies, where the real story this week wasn't the dollar. It was the ruble and the yuan going in completely opposite directions. As the broader emerging market currency basket erased its 2026 gains under renewed dollar strength, the Russian ruble tumbled roughly 8.75%. The Chinese yuan, by contrast, weakened only about 0.3% over the same stretch and is still sitting on a roughly 2.8% gain year to date, near the top of the emerging market currency pack. That's a genuinely counterintuitive split hiding under a mainstream dollar is strong headline. One major non-Western economy's currency is fraying under pressure, while another is holding remarkably steady, largely because Beijing has actively managed the yuan's appreciation this year. The reason this matters beyond a currency chart is that China's July Politburo meeting is now the thing FX desks are quietly watching for signals on whether that managed strength continues, and a shift there would ripple through everything from Asian export competitiveness to dollar-denominated emerging market debt. Now let's wake up ready. Here's your macro weather report for the week of July 5th through July 11th, and there's real structural pressure building across at least 6 fronts. First, the Fed FOMC minutes from the June meeting drop Wednesday, July 8th, and this is the first set of minutes produced under new Fed Chair Kevin Warsh. The specific signal to watch isn't whether they mention inflation, of course they will. It's whether the language around financial conditions tightens or loosens relative to prior minutes, because that phrase is the Fed's preferred way of hinting at policy direction without committing to it. What's already priced? Markets are sitting at roughly 81% odds that the Fed holds rates steady at the actual policy meeting on July 29th, according to CME FedWatch as of this week. If Wednesday's minutes show hawkish language creeping back in, watch long-duration tech and small-cap financials. They're the most rate-sensitive corners of the market and the first to reprice if that 81% hold probability starts sliding toward a hike scare.
A new Fed chair's first minutes are basically a Rorschach test. Everyone reads their own rate call into the same paragraph.
Second, tariffs. And there are 2 separate clocks running at once. The EU's deadline to implement its side of a trade agreement lands today, July 4th, and the response from Washington plays out over the days immediately following. Separately, the Section 122 tariff, that 10% measure, is set to expire around July 24th on its 150-day limit, which means Congress has to actively extend or replace it, or it lapses automatically. What's already priced? Very little, honestly. Most trade desks are treating this as background noise because tariff deadlines have passed before without full-blown escalation. The second-order consequence, if that assumption breaks, watch import-heavy retailers and auto parts suppliers specifically because they carry the thinnest margin cushion against a sudden tariff snapback, and they're the first names that get cut on any headline suggesting Section 122 lapses without a replacement.
Deadlines that keep getting extended train the market to stop pricing them until the one time they don't get extended.
Third, that USMCA question is still hanging over North American trade after last week's July 1st deadline passed without a renewal. Canada and Mexico were ready to extend, the US wasn't. So instead of expiring, the agreement now runs on a 10-year countdown clock while the 3 countries try to fix their disagreements. Watch specifically for whether USTR sets a formal renegotiation calendar this week, because a defined timeline would calm cross-border auto and agriculture supply chains, while continued ambiguity keeps a discount baked into Mexican peso-denominated manufacturing plays.
It didn't expire, it just started a 10-year clock is not the reassurance it's dressed up to be.
Fourth, earnings. The big banks kick off Q2 reporting the following Tuesday, July 14th, with Wells Fargo and JP Morgan both on the docket. That's just past our 7-day window, but positioning starts now. The specific signal to watch isn't the headline EPS beat. It's whether guidance language centers on loan growth versus cost containment, because that's the tell on whether banks think the back half of the year is about expansion or defense. What's already priced? Analysts are broadly modeling double-digit revenue growth continuing from Q1's pace. If guidance skews toward cost containment instead of loan growth, watch regional banks and consumer discretionary lenders. That's where the read-through hits hardest, because it signals the majors see softening credit demand before it shows up anywhere else after noon.
When the biggest banks in the country start talking about costs instead of growth, that's not caution, that's a forecast.
Next, capital markets. Last week's IPO batch is now trading on its own for the first time, and this week is the real test. Bending Spoons priced at the $27 midpoint for a roughly $1.6 billion raise, and Lime raised about $174 million at its NASDAQ debut, both now facing their first full week of unprotected aftermarket trading without the pop day hype cushioning them. Watch whether either stock holds above its offer price by Friday, because that's the signal institutional allocators use to decide whether to participate in the next consumer tech listing, rather than sitting it out. The next concrete catalyst is India's SBI Funds Management IPO, opening July 14th through 16th, a reminder that the IPO window itself is global, not just a NASDAQ story. If Bending Spoons and Lime both hold their offer price, expect the back half of July's IPO calendar to get more aggressive on pricing. If either breaks issue price this week, expect the next few deals to price conservatively and lean on anchor investors instead of broad retail allocation.
The first week of trading is when an IPO stops being a marketing pitch and starts being a stock, a momentum trade, a short, and all the other things we can do with equities.
Sixth, and this is the backdrop everything else sits on, yields. The 10-year Treasury closed last week at 4.49%. Still inside the 4 to 4.5 range, it's mostly held since March. What's already priced? A gradual drift toward the mid-threes by year-end, contingent on continued Fed easing. The second-order consequence to watch is what happens to regional bank net interest margins and to rate-sensitive REITs if that drift stalls instead of continuing. A stuck 10-year keeps borrowing costs elevated exactly where housing and small business credit are already showing strain. My personal watch for this week: keep an eye on how the yuan behaves around China's July Politburo meeting. If Beijing signals it's comfortable with continued yuan strength, while the rest of the emerging market basket keeps bleeding against the dollar, that's a capital flow story with legs. It would make Chinese assets look like the one clean shirt in a pile of laundry, and global allocators tend to notice that kind of divergence before it shows up in any headline.
And that is how you wake up ready. Here's the knowledge bomb. Small modular reactors, SMRs, are basically nuclear power's attempt to stop being a cathedral and start being an appliance. A traditional nuclear plant is enormous, billion-dollar-plus scale, years of construction, giant political fights, and enough concrete to make a Roman emperor blush. An SMR is the smaller version, usually under 300 megawatts per module. The pitch is simple. Build it in a factory, ship it to the site, assemble it faster, and repeat the same design often enough that nuclear starts looking less like a custom mega project and more like infrastructure manufacturing. That's the dream. Here's the consumer translation, because this isn't really about nuclear vibes. It's about cents per kilowatt hour. Your electric bill is priced in kilowatt hours. Your phone charger takes a tiny sip, your dryer takes a gulp, your air conditioner takes a fire hose. It's all kilowatt hours. SMR economics usually get discussed in megawatt hours, so let's convert. A projected SMR cost of $60 per megawatt hour comes out to about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. $100 per megawatt hour is about 10 cents. A rough first-of-a-kind project at $150 to $200 per megawatt hour is more like 15 to 20 cents before retail markups, grid costs, taxes, and utility overhead even get added on. So the whole question becomes easy to state. Can small nuclear get down into that 6 to 10 cent zone, or does it stay stuck at 15 to 20? Because at 6 to 10 cents, SMRs get genuinely interesting. At 15 to 20, they're a very expensive science project with a great logo. Solar and wind often produce cheaper electricity on a raw basis, but they're weather dependent. Gas shows up on demand but burns fuel and carries emissions risk. Batteries help, but they store power. They don't create it. SMRs are selling something different. Clean, always-on power. Not the cheapest electricity at noon on a sunny day. The electricity you can count on at 3 in the morning during a heat wave when the grid's strained and nobody wants to hear the word intermittency. That's why the data center angle keeps coming up. Companies running huge server operations aren't just buying power, they're buying certainty. And that same certainty matters just as much for industrial parks, mining sites, remote grids, military bases, and heavy manufacturing. But let's not oversell it. As of mid-2026, there are only a couple of real commercial SMR-scale examples running anywhere in the world: Russia's floating academic Lomonosov and China's HTRPM pebble-bed reactor. So yes, SMRs exist. No, nobody's proven yet that they can be built cheaply, repeatedly, and on schedule in the West. That's the entire ballgame. The first reactor proves the physics, the 10th reactor proves the business. Canada is one of the biggest test cases right now. Ontario Power Generation is building the Darlington SMR project using GE Hitachi's BWRX 300 design. 1 unit at roughly 300 megawatts, 4 units at about 1,200 megawatts, which is basically a full-size power plant built module by module. If that comes in on time and on budget, it's a major proof point. If it runs late and expensive, it becomes another nuclear cautionary tale. And fuel isn't really the sticking point. Most near-term SMRs run on uranium fuel similar to existing reactors. Some advanced designs need a more enriched fuel called HALEU, which does have a supply chain bottleneck, but that's not where the big cost lives. The big cost is construction, financing, licensing, and delay. In nuclear, the fuel rod doesn't kill you. The calendar does. So here's the knowledge bomb. SMRs aren't magic. They're a bet that nuclear can become repeatable. If every project stays custom, slow, and political, SMRs lose. If the industry can standardize designs, get regulators comfortable, build out supply chains, and make the second, third, and fourth unit cheaper than the first, SMRs become one of the most important energy stories of the 2030s. The future grid needs three things at once: cheap power, clean power, reliable power. And most sources give you two of the three and make you fight for the third. SMRs are trying to offer all three at once, but they only become real when the price drops from experimental nuclear down to boring utility math. That's the actual milestone, not when the first SMR turns on, when nobody bothers to notice because the next one's already under construction. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. Warren Buffett said at this year's Berkshire meeting that we've never had people in a more gambling mood than now. Market's like a church with a casino attached, and lately the casino's gotten very attractive. Funny, because we've built public companies for every layer of that casino. Stock in the app that takes your bet. Stock in the exchange that lists the app. Stock in the company selling data on the people betting on the app. Not capitalism anymore. Financial lasagna. Layer 1, betting on a Tuesday baseball total. Honest, it tells you what it is. Layer 2, trading a stock because the CEO has aura. That's not due diligence. That's astrology with a brokerage account. But here's the twist. The cleanest business in the building isn't the sports book. It's the exchange. The NASDAQ doesn't care if you're right. It just needs you to show up, change your mind, and pay a toll each time. The sportsbook takes the other side of your bet. The exchange just charges admission. So Buffett's right. The casino's everywhere. The only question left is which one you are. Pulling the lever, renting out the lever, or the toll road collecting a fee every time somebody mistakes movement for progress. The real lesson, in a gambling mood, the smart bet is asking who owns the table.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. The room is small and doesn't try to hide it. 2 lecterns, no slides, no phone buzzing with a payment reminder. A whiteboard in the corner still carries half an equation nobody erased. It's the kind of room built for an argument, not a lecture. Waiting, not empty. On one side, Max Levchin, fintech builder, the man who looked at the credit card and decided the whole architecture could be replaced. On the other, Benjamin Franklin, printer, diplomat, and history's most stubborn advocate for the household ledger. Neither man sits. Neither man reaches for water. Tonight's question sounds small enough to fit on a receipt. Is buy now, pay later a cleaner upgrade to consumer credit, or debt wearing better lighting? 250 years apart, and somehow neither of them looks out of place holding the same argument. Levchin goes first. He doesn't raise his voice. The revolving balance, he says, is one of the great quiet inventions in American life. A purchase becomes a payment becomes a minimum becomes a fog bank, and somewhere in that fog, interest does what interest does best. It multiplies while you're busy living your life. He's not defending debt. He's attacking the incumbent. Fixed installments aren't perfect, but they're legible. 4 payments, 6 payments. An end date you can see from where you're standing. No trick where a $400 purchase develops the stamina of a mortgage. The room leans in. Everyone in it knows the difference between a balance that will get handled and a debt with a calendar. Levchin isn't finished. The credit score is a blunt instrument. It looks backward and calls that wisdom. My model underwrites the transaction, this amount, this borrower, this month. That's not just convenience. That's a more honest allocation of trust. Franklin lifts his eyes, not offended. Worse, interested. A known obligation, he says, is better than one that breeds in the dark. If the terms are honest and the buyer is sober, yes. Zero-interest financing can be perfectly rational. Nobody expected the man on the $100 bill to endorse checkout financing. A few heads turn toward each other. Somebody in the back row actually laughs, then stops, unsure if that was allowed. But Franklin didn't get here by being sentimental about cash. Liquidity has value. If someone lends me money at no interest and I can keep my own cash working, repairing a roof, stocking a shelf, waiting on the next opportunity, I don't call that decay. I call it arithmetic. Then the blade turns. Not all debt is the same animal. Some finances a want that disappears before the bill does. Some finances capacity, a carpenter's new tools, a certificate that raises a wage, a laptop that earns more than it costs. I am not against debt. I am for purpose. A pause. The room feels the temperature shift. But your product, Mr. Levchin, is transparent. Transparency is not the same as restraint. A clear road can still run off a cliff. He lets that sit before finishing it. Splitting a purchase into 4 small pieces doesn't remove the cost. It removes the feeling of the cost. And once a price stops feeling real, desire starts calling itself planning. I can afford the payment is a counterfeit of I can afford the purchase. Half the phones in the room could testify to that sentence. Nobody laughs. Levchin doesn't flinch. He concedes it outright. Any tool that lowers friction can raise volume. Stack 5 installment plans across 4 merchants. Forget that Friday has teeth. That's not empowerment. That's fragility with a due date. Then he returns fire. But your answer depends on discipline. The system I'm replacing depends on the average person running out of discipline and then monetizes the failure. Telling people to keep a better ledger is a fine sermon. It is not a public architecture. If the mass market alternative is compounding interest and fees that reward the lender when the borrower stumbles, defending restraint while leaving the machine untouched isn't virtue. It's an elegant kind of surrender. Silence, not empty, tight. Franklin trusts character first. Levchin trusts design for the moment character gets tired. And character does get tired. Rent rises, transmissions fail, children outgrow shoes on a suspicious schedule. Franklin doesn't dodge his own weak point. Discipline is not evenly distributed and not always by choice. Sometimes the poor pay more because they have fewer options. Sometimes liquidity isn't optimization, it's survival. A sermon about thrift doesn't fix a transmission. A ledger cannot negotiate with a landlord. That admission doesn't weaken him. It's the most honest thing said all night. Levchin matches it. My own weak point. Underwriting can become a velvet rope with math behind it. A model can look neutral and still learn to exclude unfairly. And if the shopper pays no interest, the merchant pays the fee, which quietly moves into pricing anyway. There is no such thing as frictionless finance. The friction just changes address. By now, the debate has left the checkout page entirely. It was never really about an app. Levchin was asking, how do we build products that are bounded, visible, and less predatory than what came before? Franklin was asking, what does a tool make of the person using it after the purchase is done? Those are not the same question. That's the whole debate right there. Not two people disagreeing about the same thing, but two people examining 2 different rooms in the same house. Neither lectern moves. Neither man extends a hand across the gap between them. This was never staged to end in a handshake. Buy now, pay later can be smarter than a credit card and still dangerous in the wrong hands. It can protect liquidity and still encourage more spending than a person meant to do. It can widen access and still hide the true cost somewhere the buyer never thinks to look. Which one it becomes has less to do with the branding on the app and more to do with the behavior standing behind it. Stepping out of the theater for a second in plain voice. If you use one of these, read the schedule like Franklin would, and shop like Levchin's underwriting expects you to, as someone with a real finite budget, not an infinite one with a due date attached. That's not a verdict. It's just the only honest homework either man left you with. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Every week, we spend part of this show looking for value hiding under something nobody thought to photograph. The overlooked thing, the boring layer, the place where the money, the science, or the future is sitting quietly while everyone else is busy staring at the polished surface. So let's end with a story that might be the original version of that idea. And it begins with a man who spent his career studying dirt. In the early 20th century, tuberculosis was one of the great terrors of modern life. It was everywhere. It moved through families, cities, workplaces, and schools. And medicine, for all its growing confidence, had almost nothing to throw at it. The standard treatment was not a miracle drug. It was not a procedure. It was not some precision-guided medical weapon. It was the sanatorium. Fresh air, sunlight, rest, better food, hope with windows. Doctors could help a patient's body endure the disease. They could move them to the mountains, give them clean sheets, and tell them to breathe deeply. But they could not attack the infection itself. Tuberculosis was not just a medical problem. It was a reminder that the modern world still had ancient enemies. Enter Selman Waksman. Waksman was born near Kiev, emigrated to the United States, studied at Rutgers, earned his doctorate at Berkeley, and then became fascinated by something that did not look like the future of medicine at all: soil. Not gold, not oil, not uranium, soil. The stuff under your shoes. The stuff people sweep off the porch. the stuff that developers scrape away before putting up something investors can tour in a hard hat. But Waxman saw something else. He was studying the microorganisms living in soil, and he noticed that certain microbes seemed to be fighting other microbes all the time. Underground, there was a constant chemical war happening at microscopic scale. Bacteria were not just sitting there politely. They were competing, defending territory, producing compounds, and trying to survive. And Waxman had the very unfashionable idea that maybe those tiny weapons could be useful. So his lab built a process. They collected soil samples, they isolated organisms, they screened them again and again and again. Thousands of samples, years of work, no glamour, no heroic montage, no one standing in front of a whiteboard saying, "Let's disrupt infectious disease." It was closer to scientific prospecting. Turn over a rock, test what's underneath, find nothing, turn over another rock. Then, in 1943, one of those samples delivered. A strain of soil bacteria produced a compound called streptomycin, and streptomycin became the first effective treatment against tuberculosis in human history. Think about that for a second. One of the deadliest diseases on Earth met its match in ordinary dirt. That is the part of invention we love to clean up after the fact. We make it sound inevitable. We put the discovery in a textbook, name the compound, add the date, and move on. But at the time, it was not obvious. It was not glamorous. It was not located where the story would have told you to look. The answer was not in a palace of medicine. It was in a handful of soil from New Jersey. Waxman would later be credited with helping popularize the word antibiotic, and in 1952, he received the Nobel Prize. But the story doesn't stop with the drug, because the economics of discovery created a second invention, an institution. The royalties from streptomycin helped fund the Waxman Institute of Microbiology at Rutgers, along with a foundation that carried the work forward. One overlooked soil organism did not just help launch a new era in medicine, it seeded permanent research infrastructure. Labs, students, careers, generations of microbiologists trained inside the aftershock of one patient, repetitive, unglamorous search. That's the lesson. The breakthrough was not a lightning bolt in a shiny building. It was patience applied to something everyone else was walking past. And that may be the most important kind of invention to remember right now, because we live in a world obsessed with the visible frontier. The biggest model, the loudest launch, the most cinematic demo, the company with the cleanest investor deck, and the most dramatic founder photo. But history keeps whispering the same contrarian note. The future often begins in the places that look too boring to fund, too ordinary to brand, and too slow to explain on a stage. Sometimes the next industry is not hiding in the cloud. Sometimes it is hiding in the dirt. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From soil microbes nobody photographs to a nuclear reactor nobody notices when it's working right. From off-grid radios to on-grid discipline, and from a 400-year-old ledger to an app built to replace it. The pattern was simple. Overlooked wins out. First principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Till next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.